The Ritual. Nobody in the Cathara Interstellar District knew Marcus Webb's name. This was not unusual. The district was the kind of place where names were liabilities, where knowing someone's name meant acknowledging their existence, and acknowledging someone's existence in Sector 9 meant you might one day be held responsible for having seen them last. It was a place built on the careful architecture of collective ignorance, where every sentient being had developed, through long practice, the refined skill of looking directly at something without seeing it at all. So Marcus Webb moved through the district as most humans moved through it, beneath notice, beneath comment, beneath the social calculus of beings who had bigger problems than one unremarkable mammal with a canvas bag. The alien merchants who set up their stalls along the outer ring of Sector 9 knew him only as the soft one. This was not, in the Volkai trade tongue, an insult exactly, it was more of a taxonomic observation, the way one might label an item in an inventory. Soft. Bipedal, mammalian, warm-blooded probably, unlikely to cause trouble. They noted his passing the way they noted the acid fog, a regular feature of the environment, navigated around without thought, not worth discussing at length. He arrived every morning at precisely 6:14 a.m. The merchants knew this not because they watched him, they were very careful not to, but because their bodies had learned the timing the way bodies learn anything repeated enough times. Without permission, without intention, purely through the accumulated weight of routine. The Gorathi spice seller would find herself glancing toward the eastern end of the market at 6:12 without knowing why. The Pelari fabric merchant, 3 stalls down, would notice his own secondary hands tightening on his merchandise at 6:13. A reflex built not from any direct memory but from the collective nervous understanding of what came at 6:14. What followed that soft, unremarkable human with his large canvas bag that smelled of roasted meat and something sweet. What came next was the walk into Sector 9's eastern quarter. What came after that was the part nobody talked about. The Volkai dockworkers had their own name for Marcus Webb, one that translated approximately as the fool who courts death, though a more precise rendering might have been the one who walks toward the thing that ends things, apparently on purpose, repeatedly, without being ended. They said it without contempt. If anything, there was something in their rough, clicking speech when they said it that sounded faintly like reverence. Or at least like the particular, bewildered respect one feels for someone who does something that the entire accumulated wisdom of your species has declared unsurvivable, and keeps doing it anyway, and keeps surviving. The Pelari bureaucrats processing transit permits on the upper floor of the district authority building simply called him a liability. They had on 3 separate occasions drafted formal notices to have him removed from the district under the Omega Apex Proximity Ordinance, which stated in clear galactic standard that no civilian being was permitted within 2 kilometers of a confirmed Omega Apex entity without a Class 7 hazard designation, a minimum 3-member escort team, a signed waiver of interstellar insurance claims, and in the case of biological entities, a last will and testament filed with a licensed galactic notary. Marcus Webb had none of these things. He had a canvas bag and a piece of salvage metal he used as a table. All 3 notices had been drafted. All 3 had been filed in the pending folder of Senior Compliance Officer Drathnine, who was a very thorough bureaucrat and an absolute coward, and who had looked at the task of physically delivering those notices to the only human who spent time near the thing in the eastern ruins, and had decided each time that the paperwork could wait until next week. None of them said anything to stop him, because none of them wanted to get closer to her. She lay coiled around the eastern ruins of what had once been a galactic commerce hub before the collapse. The collapse itself was ancient history, now 3 centuries of dust and silence, the kind of event that in other parts of the galaxy had been mourned, processed, rebuilt from, but not here. Not in Sector 9's eastern quarter, where the ruins of the hub stood exactly as they had fallen. Towers of pale commerstone cracked down their centers, hab units crumbled into each other like exhausted bodies, old trade lines still visible on the ground beneath decades of debris and organic growth, leading to market squares that had once held 10,000 merchants and now held only silence and the memory of 10,000 merchants and her. 300 meters of obsidian scale and ancient malice. That was the standard description in the Galactic Registry, and it was accurate in the way that technical descriptions are accurate, capturing the facts while missing everything that mattered. Because numbers and classification words could tell you she was 300 meters long, that her scales were black as collapsed stars, that she had been classified Omega Apex by every sentient species that had ever developed a classification system. What they could not tell you was what it felt like to stand at the edge of her coiled tail and look the length of her body and understand, in the wordless part of your brain that predated language and reason, that you were not looking at an animal. You were looking at something that had watched empires form and dissolve the way a river watches stones. something for whom the entire recorded history of most sentient species was not even a chapter but a paragraph, barely worth noting, already half forgotten. Her body was so vast that the abandoned towers she had coiled around looked like toys stacked against her spine, decorative, quaint, the kind of things a very large creature might collect simply because it had the space. The ruins that every other species in the district carefully, quietly avoided had become, simply, her furniture. Her name, according to the oldest galactic records, the ones kept in the deep archives that most governments preferred not to look at directly, the ones written in scripts that hadn't been used for active communication in 800 years, was Soverus Kalendrath the Undying. The title was not ceremonial. It was not a name given to her by admirers or worshippers, though she had had both in quantities that would stagger the imagination. It was a simple, observed fact, noted by the archivist who first recorded her existence in the 3rd century of the Common Reckoning, and confirmed by every subsequent record keeper who had encountered her since. She does not die. Civilizations around her had died. Species around her had evolved, peaked, declined, and vanished into the galactic record as historical footnotes. Stars had aged, systems had shifted, and Kalendrath had watched all of it from wherever she happened to be resting at the time, amber eyes half open, patient as geology. She had watched 17 civilizations rise and collapse. Not as metaphor, as direct observation from beginning to end, start to finish, the full arc of each one visible to her the way the full arc of a single day is visible to a human looking back on it from evening. She had been offered tribute by emperors who built their entire theological frameworks around her existence, who wrote her name into their sacred texts as proof that the universe contained things beyond mortal comprehension, who sent processions of decorated servants carrying the finest of everything their civilization produced to lay at her feet. She had accepted some of it. She had eaten some of the servants. Occasionally she had eaten the emperors. The theological frameworks had generally not survived this, which suggested they had not been as robust as their authors had hoped. She had eaten ambassadors. This was recorded fact, cited in 47 separate diplomatic incident reports filed with the Galactic Arbitration Court over the course of 6 centuries, and the reason that the standard operating procedure for any interstellar diplomatic mission that found itself in proximity to a confirmed sighting of Soverus Kalendrath was, without exception, immediate withdrawal. Marcus Webb called her Kali. He had been doing this for 11 months. Nobody knew exactly when it had started, because for the first several weeks nobody had been paying attention. He was, after all, unremarkable. He was the soft one, the maintenance worker from the depot on the west side of the district, the human whose name nobody knew. He moved below the threshold of collective notice, and so the early mornings had simply happened the way things below notice happen, quietly, repeatedly, without witnesses, without comment. By the time anyone realized what he was doing, he had already been doing it long enough that the sheer continuity of it had become its own kind of shield. Stopping him now would require acknowledging that they had watched him do this for 4 months without intervening, which would require explaining why, which would require admitting that the real reason was that none of them had wanted to go near the dragon, which would require a degree of institutional self-reflection that Senior Compliance Officer Drathnine found deeply uncomfortable and preferred to avoid. So he continued. Every morning, rain or shine or acid fog, which descended over Sector 9 with particular enthusiasm, a product of the industrial runoff from the upper district processing plants mixing badly with the local atmospheric chemistry, producing a faintly yellow-green mist that smelled of copper and old machinery and made every surface slightly tacky. He would walk the length of the outer market, turn east at the old transit hub, and follow the path that led into the ruins. He always brought the same canvas bag. It was large, dark green, worn at the bottom left corner where the stitching had started to go, and he'd repaired it himself with a different color thread. It was not a bag that had started life as a food transport vessel. It was a standard equipment bag from the depot, the kind used to carry maintenance supplies and replacement parts, and he'd repurposed it for this. Inside, wrapped in layers of preservation cloth that he folded and refolded with the particular care of someone who takes ordinary things seriously, he carried food. Smoked brisket. He prepared it himself in the small kitchen of the single-room housing unit he rented on the 3rd floor of a building that leaned slightly to the left, and whose water pipes made a sound every night at 2 a.m. that he had described to 3 separate maintenance workers as like a goose being played like a tuba. The brisket took 4 hours to smoke properly, and he did it on a small portable unit he kept on the fire step outside his window, and the smell of it drove his neighbors to varying degrees of distraction, and he didn't apologize for it because he considered it a public service. Something should smell good in this district. Honeyed grain cakes, bought from a Fennery baker 2 stalls into the outer market who made them fresh each morning, and had over the course of 11 months noticed that the soft human bought 12 of them every single day without variation and had stopped even asking how many he wanted. She simply had 12 ready for him when he arrived, wrapped in their wax paper, still warm from the second bake. She had never asked what they were for. She suspected she didn't want to know, and she had been operating in Sector 9 long enough to trust that instinct completely. A thermos of something warm he'd made himself. The precise contents varied depending on what he had in the kitchen, but it was generally some variety of broth or spiced beverage that heated slowly over the course of the night in the small unit he kept on his kitchen shelf. He brought it for himself as much as anything, the walk being long and the acid fog being cold, and he would drink from it as he set up his makeshift table. Sometimes fish, when the market was good, which was infrequently, fish being expensive and difficult to source in the district. But occasionally a trade ship would pass through with a fresh cargo hold and the prices would drop briefly, and he would buy 3 or 4 of the largest ones available and wrap them carefully and add them to the bag. Once, memorably, an entire roasted something, a large barrel-shaped creature from the outer systems whose name Marcus could never pronounce correctly but whose meat apparently smelled extraordinary, that had taken up most of the bag and required both his arms to carry, and had left him walking in a slight forward lean the entire way. He would lay it all out on the flat piece of salvage metal that he dragged along every morning and dragged back every evening. The salvage metal was a section of old commerce hub flooring, thick, slightly convex, just over a meter across, that he had found in the debris field on his third visit and claimed as his own. It served as both surface and slight elevation, and he had over the months developed a precise arrangement for laying out the food. Brisket to the left, cakes to the right, thermos in the center for his own use, fish or supplementary items placed along the back edge with a gap between them so nothing overlapped. He had never been told to arrange it this way. There had been no instruction, no feedback, no indication that the arrangement mattered. He had simply noticed somewhere around the 5th or 6th week that when he arranged it in this order, the amber eye that was always half open and watching him tracked first to the brisket, then to the cakes, then more slowly with what he had interpreted as something like appreciation across the full spread. And so he kept doing it that way, because it seemed right, the way knowing exactly how someone takes their coffee seems right after long enough. He would talk quietly the way a person talks to someone who might not be listening, but might also appreciate the effort. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about it, more remarkable in many ways than the fact that he walked up to an Omega Apex Predator every morning without body armor or escort or legal documentation. The talking. The easy, unhurried, entirely comfortable talking of a man who had decided, somewhere in the logic of his own unobserved private reasoning, that silence between them would be worse than words and that the words didn't need to be grand. He talked about his day. Specifically, he talked about the day ahead, the maintenance calls that had come in overnight, the particular stubborn blockage in the coolant line of the secondary processing unit that he'd been trying to fix for 2 weeks and kept outsmarting him. The meeting he had scheduled with the depot floor manager that he was not looking forward to because the floor manager had the conversational style of a malfunctioning automated announcement system. He talked about the weather, offering his personal opinion on it with the firm conviction of someone who takes weather personally. He talked about the strange news he'd heard at the depot, the political shifts in the upper district, the rumored arrival of a trade delegation, the ongoing saga of his neighbor's claim that someone was stealing his preserved food rations despite the fact that, as Marcus had pointed out several times, his neighbor had no lock on his storage unit and lived next to 3 Gorathi teenagers who were going through a growth phase. Small things, ordinary, unremarkable, deeply human things. He talked about the broken water pipe in his housing block. He had been talking about this particular pipe for 6 weeks, updating the situation with the dedication of a correspondent filing daily reports from a slow-moving front. First the discovery of the problem, then the first maintenance request, then the follow-up maintenance request, then the third request which he had escalated to building management, then the discovery that building management was technically a single elderly Pelari male named Oren who had inherited the building from his estranged sibling and had no idea what a water pipe was, then the detailed explanation of water pipes he had provided to Oren, then Oren's decision to think about it. Kaelindrath never moved while he did this. She kept one enormous amber eye half open, watching him the way an ocean watches a rowboat, with the absolute ancient certainty that she could destroy it without effort, and the faint, puzzling question of why she hadn't. The eye did not blink on any schedule that corresponded to mammalian rhythms. It opened and closed according to its own deep logic, the way tides respond to forces that have nothing to do with the surface. Sometimes, when the morning light came in from the right angle, the amber of it caught the light and blazed briefly golden, and the whole ruin seemed to glow with it, the old broken towers lit from one end to the other by reflected dragon fire. She watched him unpack. She watched him arrange the food on the salvage metal with his precise, particular order. She watched him pour from his thermos and drink and make a face if it had gone colder than he intended and shrug it off and drink anyway. She watched him talk, his hands occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point, his expression shifting through the full, transparent range of a face that had never learned to hide what it was thinking, frustration about the pipe, mild satisfaction about the brisket, genuine amusement at his own descriptions of Oren's confusion. She watched all of it with the amber eye half open, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not signal anything that could be read as welcome or threat. And she always ate what he left. This was the detail that separated the watching from mere tolerance. She could have ignored the food. She was 300 meters of ancient predator who had in her time fasted for decades without apparent discomfort. She did not need smoked brisket and honeyed grain cakes from a maintenance worker's canvas bag. The food was not survival. It was not tribute in any form she recognized. It was too small for that, too ordinary, brought in a worn equipment bag by a being whose entire body she could have swallowed in a single motion without the need to chew. She ate it anyway, every day, everything he left. The salvage metal tray was always clean when he came back the next morning to set it up again. Nobody in the Cathara Interstellar District had noticed yet that this was the most extraordinary fact in Sector 9. Not the human walking up to the dragon, not the dragon failing to destroy the human, but the deliberate, daily, continued act of acceptance, the choosing, again and again, to take what was offered. From a being who had watched 17 civilizations offer her everything they had. She chose this, the brisket, the grain cakes, the ongoing developments in the water pipe situation. She chose the unremarkable human who had decided, 11 months ago, with no particular fanfare, that she had been alone too long. And every morning as he walked back west along the path through the ruins, canvas bag empty over his shoulder, thermos tucked under his arm, Calendrath the Undying would watch him go with one amber eye half open, patient as geology, quiet as deep water, and something would settle back into stillness in whatever vast interior landscape constituted her inner life. He would be back tomorrow. She knew this with absolute certainty, the way she knew the movement of stars. She had very quietly begun to count on it. The observers. On the 43rd day of surveillance, Agent Thessavorn of the Interstellar Reparations Authority filed her 9th report with a note attached that read, "I no longer know what we are watching." This was for Agent Thessavorn an extraordinary admission. She was a Kalahari, a species whose evolutionary history had gifted them with six-lobed brains optimized for pattern recognition, contextual analysis, and the rapid classification of observed phenomena into known categorical frameworks. Kalahari made exceptional investigators for exactly this reason. They did not get confused. They did not file reports with notes attached expressing epistemological uncertainty. They watched things, identified what those things were, filed precise and accurate documentation, and moved on to the next assignment with the brisk efficiency of minds that found ambiguity physically uncomfortable, like a splinter in the cognitive architecture. Thessavorn had been filing uncertain reports since day 4. The first 3 reports had been models of professional clarity. Subject Alpha, human male, age estimated 34-38 standard years, maintenance worker designation based on depot uniform, no registered threat profile, no criminal record in Galactic Standard database, no apparent affiliation with any known organization, religious order, or pact holder lineage. Approach method, direct. Threat response elicited from entity Calendrath, none. Duration of contact, 23 minutes. Subject Alpha departed unharmed. Recommend continued observation. By report 4, the cracks had begun to show. Subject Alpha returned for 4th consecutive day, brought smoked brisket. Entity Calendrath consumed it. No previous record in IRA files of Entity Calendrath accepting offered food from a non-tribute context since the 3rd century. Recommend continued observation. Note, uncertain how to categorize this. By report 7, I have reviewed 1,400 years of archived documentation on Entity Calendrath. I can find no precedent for this. Recommend continued observation. Note, beginning to question whether standard observation frameworks apply. By report 9, the notes. She submitted it, stared at it for a long moment, and then, because she was a professional and professionalism demanded honesty even when honesty was uncomfortable, left it attached and filed it anyway. Senior Attorney Quivethsal would read it. He would probably understand exactly what she meant. He had after all been watching the same surveillance feeds she had, and she had seen his face during the viewing sessions. And his face had been doing things that Branathi faces were not generally known for doing. Specifically, expressing open, undisguised bewilderment. The IRA had been called in because of a legal matter. A very large legal matter in every sense of the word. The Interstellar Reparations Authority was not, by nature, an organization that dealt with large matters voluntarily. It was a body staffed by careful beings who preferred their cases to involve clear jurisdictional boundaries, documented violations, solvent defendants, and most importantly, defendants who could be served notice without requiring the serving attorney to update their will first. The IRA processed approximately 14,000 cases per standard year, the vast majority of which involved corporate entities, deceased estates, dormant territorial claims, and the occasional mid-sized government that had forgotten to pay its arbitration fees. It did not, as a general rule, process cases involving elder dragons. Calendrath the Undying had accumulated over 17 centuries of existence an extraordinary portfolio of unresolved legal claims. This was not in itself surprising. 17 centuries was a long time, and the galactic legal system was the kind of structure that generated claims the way old buildings generated dust, constantly, inevitably, and in quantities that became truly impressive only when someone finally decided to look. What was surprising was the scope. Territorial rights over 4 abandoned star systems. The systems in question had been, at various points in galactic history, claimed by empires that no longer existed, corporations that had dissolved, and one particularly ambitious individual who had registered the claim under a personal deed, and then died without heirs approximately 600 years ago, leaving the legal status of the systems in a state of such profound unresolved complexity that 3 separate arbitration panels had reviewed the files, written extensive summaries, and quietly passed the matter to their successors rather than attempt resolution. Calendrath had been in all 4 systems at various points. She had, according to the oldest records, eaten 2 of the original claiming parties. The question of whether consumption constituted legal transfer of territorial rights was one that the Galactic Arbitration Court had been carefully avoiding for 4 centuries. Breach of pact lawsuits filed by 3 extinct civilizations, whose surviving descendants had proven surprisingly litigious. The Mothari were the most aggressive of these, a small but extraordinarily well-organized community of beings who shared genetic lineage with the civilization Calendrath had apparently destroyed in what the records described only as a territorial dispute in the 9th century. They had over the past 200 years assembled a legal team of such dedicated ferocity that their lead attorney had once famously described their case as a moral obligation to the dead, a professional obligation to the truth, and a personal obligation to see this through if it takes another 600 years, which frankly it might. The IRA respected this position. It was also deeply tired of the Mothari's annual correspondence asking for case status updates. And then there was the moons. The pending case before the Galactic Arbitration Court involving mineral rights on a moon she had reportedly swallowed in the 3rd century and had not, as of yet, returned. This case was, by the assessment of every legal scholar who had reviewed it, completely unprecedented in the history of galactic jurisprudence. The moon in question, designated K447 in the current astronomical registry, formerly known as Pelinoth's cradle in the records of the civilization that had originally settled it, had contained significant deposits of Veth crystal, a mineral with applications in faster-than-light navigation that had in the 3rd century made it extraordinarily valuable. The civilization that had owned the mining rights had, according to historical records, attempted to prevent Calendrath from resting on the moon's surface on the grounds that her body weight was causing geological disruption to their extraction operations. She had eaten the moons. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. She had, according to 3 separate eyewitness accounts filed with the arbitration court's predecessor body in the 4th century, simply opened her mouth and consumed the moon in its entirety, geological disruption and crystal deposits and mining operations and all. The eyewitnesses had been observers from a neighboring system. They had filed their accounts in a state of what the original clerk had described as profound theological distress. The arbitration court had been arguing about standing, jurisdiction, and the fundamental question of whether a consumed celestial body could still be the subject of a mineral rights claim ever since. The IRA had been tasked with serving notice of these proceedings to the Elder Dragon in person. In person, those 2 words had sat in the assignment brief like a small, polite explosion, and every member of the IRA team assigned to the case had read them and then read them again, and then looked at each other with the specific expression shared by beings of all species who have just realized that the task they have been assigned is one that their organization considers entirely reasonable, and that they consider an invitation to their own funeral. No one had managed to get close enough to do it. 7 attempts, 7 teams composed of the IRA's most experienced field agents, beings who had served notice on warlords and corporate crime syndicates, and 3 separate sitting heads of government with outstanding warrants, who had approached the boundary of Sector 9's eastern quarter, looked at what lay coiled in the ruins, and found, in the deep wordless logic of their bodies, a unanimous and unambiguous answer to the question of whether they were going to walk any further. The answer was no. Not a fearful no, not a reckless bravado-suppressing no. A simple biological species survival instinct no, the kind that exists in every evolved organism as a final failsafe against the kind of decisions that look reasonable in briefing rooms and catastrophic in execution. The kind of no that had kept their respective ancestors alive long enough to become their ancestors. The seventh team had made it closer than the others, had actually crossed the first line of ruins, had gotten near enough to see the amber eye, had experienced what their team leader later described in her official report as a sensation of complete and total scale awareness, the understanding of one's own size and fragility relative to the observed entity, resulting in unanimous involuntary withdrawal. She had written this in very precise professional language, and it had come across clearly as what it was, which was, "We saw her properly and then we left, and we are not ashamed of this, and we are not going back." That's when Senior Attorney Quiveth Saul had requested surveillance authorization for Sector 9. Quiveth Saul was, by any measure, a formidable being. Brenathi were not a species that produced many lawyers. Their cultural frameworks generally resolved disputes through a combination of communal deliberation and extremely long memory, neither of which translated well into the adversarial structure of galactic jurisprudence. Those Brenathi who did enter the legal profession tended to do so with the energy of beings who had chosen the most improbable possible path, and were committed to being extraordinary at it, partly out of genuine dedication, and partly because going home having been merely mediocre was not an option their families would have found acceptable. Quiveth Saul had been practicing interstellar law for 31 years. He had 4 eyes, typical for Brenathi, set in a broad, gray-green face with the particular stillness of a species that expressed almost everything internally, showing only what they chose to show, a quality that made them exceptional poker players and deeply unsettling opponents in depositions. He was tall for his species, with the deliberate, unhurried movements of someone who had learned decades ago that the first person to move quickly in a tense situation was usually the first person to make a mistake. He had argued cases before the Galactic Arbitration Court 17 times. He had won 14. He had 2 pending appeals on the remaining 3, and he expected to win at least one of them once the presiding panel stopped being squeamish about the precedent implications. He had never, in 31 years, encountered a case that required him to approach an elder dragon. When he requested the surveillance authorization, he had told himself it was purely strategic, information gathering. If they couldn't approach the dragon directly, then understanding the mechanism by which contact was possible, studying whoever could approach her, learning what they did, replicating the method was simply good lawyering. It was not, he had been careful to tell himself, an admission that he was afraid. It was resource efficiency. He had expected a warrior. Someone from one of the old pact-holding bloodlines, perhaps. There were families who maintained ancient agreements with apex entities, whose lineages were bound to specific dragons or leviathans or deep space predators through covenants written before the current galactic order existed. It was always possible that someone from such a family had ended up in Sector 9. The district attracted outcasts and exiles, and those whose histories had carried them far from their origins. He had expected a shaman, a spiritual practitioner of some kind, versed in the old protocols, trained in the forms of address and approach that various traditions had developed over centuries of attempting to communicate with beings whose cognition operated on timescales that made normal conversations structurally impossible. He had expected, at minimum, someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. He got Marcus Webb. The surveillance operation was run from a rented space in the Upper District, a small, climate-controlled room in a building that had a clear sightline over the ruins if you used the right equipment, which the IRA's technical team had set up with careful efficiency. High-resolution optical feeds, audio capture capable of filtering out the ambient district noise and isolating a single voice at 200 meters, thermal imaging as a secondary track. It was good equipment, properly calibrated, and it produced a surveillance feed of extraordinary clarity. Quiveth Saul had watched it every morning for 43 days. He sat now in the viewing chair. The room was not large enough for the 3 of them to sit comfortably, so the Dorikai had remained standing, which they did with the comfortable stillness of beings whose architecture was built for it, with the feed running on the primary screen and his secondary and tertiary eyes monitoring the data readouts on the panels to either side. The Dorikai security escorts, Construct 7 and Construct 8, stood at parade rest behind his chair, their attention on the screen with the focused blankness of minds trying to process something that kept slipping out of their categorical framework. They were extraordinary beings, the Dorikai constructs. Built rather than born, engineered over 200 years by a collective of Dorikai mastercrafters who had wanted to create the perfect security entity, they stood at roughly 3 meters each, composed of a semi-biological materials matrix that gave them both the structural resilience of heavy machinery and the adaptability of organic tissue. Construct 7 had once, as noted in the file that Quiveth Sol had read during the background briefing, subdued a rogue warship by pulling its primary drive coupling out through the hull with his bare manipulation limbs. Construct 8 had, on a separate occasion, stood in the path of a plasma discharge, raided to eliminate a city block, and walked out of it with minor surface scoring and an expression of mild irritation. They were watching a human male talk about a water pipe, with expressions that could only be described as baffled. "He's talking about a broken water pipe," said Construct 7. His voice was a deep, resonant thing, built for command and clarity, and he used it now in the careful tone of a being reading aloud from a document they didn't fully understand. His translator, they both carried standard galactic units, though their own communication operated on several additional frequencies that the units didn't bother with, rendered Marcus's words in flat galactic standard and delivered them into the room with perfect fidelity. In his housing block, he is upset that maintenance hasn't fixed it. "He has been talking for 9 minutes, said Construct 8, with the precision of an entity whose internal clock was accurate to the microsecond. "The dragon has not moved." There was a quality to those last 4 words, delivered in Construct 8's flat, factual voice, that contained something more than observation. Something that, in a less precisely engineered being, might have been called unease. "The dragon has not moved" was a statement of fact, yes. It was also a statement of profound wrongness. The kind of wrongness that all of Construct 8's carefully developed security instincts had been shouting at him since day 1 of surveillance, every morning without resolution. Something that large should not hold that still for anything. And certainly not for this. "She is listening," Quiveth Sol said quietly. He had leaned forward in his chair without noticing, drawn toward the screen by the same pull he felt every morning during the feeds. The sense that if he just got close enough, looked carefully enough, he might finally understand what he was seeing in the way that he needed to understand it, with the clean click of comprehension rather than the persistent, unsatisfying feeling of looking at something through glass. His 4 eyes were fixed on Kalendrath's enormous amber one, tracking the way it moved, slowly, with absolute deliberateness. The way very large things move when they are being careful to move gently, following Marcus, as the man shifted along the makeshift table to refill the tray with more honeyed grain cakes. There was something in that eye. Quiveth Sol had spent 31 years reading faces, expressions, the 1,000 small involuntary tells that beings of all species produced despite their best efforts at concealment. It was the foundational skill of his profession, not the law itself, but the reading of those who operated within it, the understanding of what was felt beneath what was said. He was, by general professional consensus, exceptional at it. He had been trying to read Kalendrath's eye for 43 days. What he found there kept resisting his frameworks, kept sliding out of the categories he tried to apply to it, kept presenting itself as something his experience had not equipped him to name cleanly. But today, watching it move with such deliberate, unhurried attention along the path of one unremarkable human refilling a tray, he found a word for it that fit better than any of the others had. Patience, gentle, deliberate patience. Not the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that kind, had seen it in the eyes of beings far smaller and no less dangerous, and it had a particular quality of compressed tension in it, a coiled readiness beneath the stillness. This was different. This was the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. Nothing else it would rather be doing. No portion of its attention allocated to anything other than the present moment and the being moving through it. She was not waiting for him to finish. She was not tolerating the time until the food appeared. She was simply present, attending, the way very old beings sometimes attend to things, with the full, unhurried weight of awareness that comes from having learned over a very long time that most moments pass too quickly and the ones worth keeping deserve the whole of you. "She's waiting for him to get to the point," Construct 7 offered. He said it with the confidence of a being who had processed the available data and arrived at what seemed like the most logical conclusion, and there was something almost hopeful in it. The hope that there was a point, that the water pipe was a preamble to something, that the situation would resolve into a recognizable shape. "No," said Quiveth Sol. He said it softly with the weight of certainty behind it. "She doesn't care about the point, she just wants him to keep talking." The room was quiet for a moment. It was the particular quality of quiet that falls when something true has been said in a space where true things have been in short supply. A quiet that has texture to it, that presses slightly against the ears, that gives the words just spoken room to settle and be understood. "He has no idea," Construct 8 said finally. His voice was unchanged, flat, precise, factual, but the words carried something that his engineering had not been designed to produce, and that had appeared anyway, the way unexpected things appear in sufficiently complex systems, something very close to wonder. He has no idea what she is. Quivethsal was quiet for a moment. On screen, Marcus Webb had finished refilling the tray and had straightened up and was speaking again, his free hand making a small, illustrative gesture, apparently describing the building manager's continued failure to grasp the concept of pipe maintenance, with the easy expressiveness of a man who talked with his whole body and saw no reason to apologize for it. He knows exactly what she is, Quivethsal said slowly. He reached forward and tapped the screen, his finger resting lightly on the image. Watch his face when he looks at her. The surveillance feed was high-resolution enough. They had spared no expense on the equipment, the case budget being what it was, to catch it in complete and unambiguous detail. The moment Marcus Webb glanced up from his bag mid-sentence. The way his eyes changed when they found the amber one looking back at him. A softening, not dramatic, not the exaggerated expression of someone performing feeling for an audience, but the small, genuine, entirely private relaxation of a face that had stopped guarding itself. The way the corner of his mouth pulled up just a fraction, not quite a smile, or perhaps the seed of one, the beginning of a smile that had decided it didn't need to fully arrive to be real, before he looked back down at his bag and kept talking. He knows, Quivethsal said, he just doesn't care, not in the way that means ignorant, in the way that means decided. He paused, searching for the right shape for what he was seeing, the right words for something his 31 years had not given him a prepared phrase for. He looked at what she is and he made a decision about it, and he kept walking. And he keeps making that decision every morning. He just chooses not to let it be the thing that matters most. He paused. On the screen, Caelendrath's tail moved. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of motion that the thermal imaging picked up more clearly than the optical. A shift in the vast architecture of her body that translated, at the scale of the surveillance feed, to a movement of perhaps a meter and a half, the tail curling with extraordinary slowness through a few degrees of arc in the direction of the human standing at the makeshift table. Not a threatening move, not a hunting move. Something else entirely, something that Quivethsal's mind went looking for a comparison for and found, after a moment's searching, in the most unexpected of places. The way a cat moves toward warmth it has decided it wants but prefers not to want too obviously. The adjustment that is not quite an admission. The closing of distance that maintains, through its very slowness, a thin fiction of coincidence. And somehow, Quivethsal said, watching the tail settle into its new position, watching Marcus Webb continue to talk without apparently noticing the shift, watching Caelendrath's amber eye track him with that same patient, whole, unhurried attention, somehow she finds that extraordinary. The room held its quiet. Construct 7 and Construct 8 stood without moving. On the screen, Marcus Webb finished his account of the water pipe situation, paused to drink from his thermos, made a face at the temperature, and began telling Caelendrath about the maintenance call he had scheduled for that afternoon involving what he described as the single most confused coolant line in the history of district infrastructure. Caelendrath listened. The amber eye moved with him. The tail did not move again. It had found the distance it wanted, the proximity it was willing to acknowledge. Quivethsal sat back slowly in his chair, his 4 eyes still on the screen, and thought about what it meant that the oldest living thing in the known galaxy had spent 11 months choosing every morning to be here, to be present for this, for the brisket and the grain cakes and the ongoing saga of Sector 9's municipal infrastructure failures and the honest, unself-conscious company of one human maintenance worker who had looked at an Omega Apex predator and decided to bring her breakfast. He thought about 17 civilizations, about emperors who had built theological frameworks around her, about ambassadors she had eaten, about the moon she had swallowed because it was inconvenient. He thought about Marcus Webb's face when he looked at her. He thought, we have been trying to understand what he is doing that makes her not kill him, but that is the wrong question. The right question, the one that had been sitting in the surveillance footage for 43 days, waiting for someone to ask it, was different. It was quieter. It was the question that Thessavorn had been circling in 9 increasingly uncertain reports without quite finding the words for, the question that had made Constructate say he has no idea, in a voice that sounded, underneath its precision, a little like awe. The right question was, when was the last time anyone simply came to see her? Not to negotiate, not to offer tribute, not to file legal notice or seek favor or make claims or attempt to communicate information of strategic importance, not for any reason that had anything to do with what she could give them or what they needed from her. Just came, brought food, talked about ordinary things, and came back the next day and the day after and the day after that for 11 months through acid fog and rain and whatever the morning brought. Quivethsal looked at the screen for a long time. Then he reached for his data tablet, opened his case files, and began to think very carefully about what they were going to do next. The introduction. On day 44, Quivethsal decided they'd observed long enough. He made this decision at 3:17 a.m., lying on the narrow sleeping platform in his rented district room, staring at the ceiling with all four eyes open, and his mind running the same loop it had been running since he'd filed the evening's review notes and tried, unsuccessfully, to sleep. He had reviewed the loop from every angle available to 31 years of legal training and considerable personal intelligence, and the loop kept arriving at the same place. There was no version of this case that resolved itself from a surveillance room. The surveillance had told him everything he needed to know about why contact was possible. It had told him nothing about how to replicate it, because the honest answer, the answer that kept surfacing through the professional frameworks he kept trying to submerge it under, was that what Marcus Webb did was not a technique. It was not a method. It was not something that could be extracted from the man who did it and transplanted into a briefing document for someone else to follow. It was simply him, the specific unreplicable fact of him, his ease, his warmth, his absolute lack of performance about any of it, the way he showed up, the way he stayed. You couldn't learn that from watching, you couldn't distill it into a protocol. What you could do, what Quivethsal had concluded, lying in the dark at 3:17 a.m. with the acid fog pressing damply against the window, was walk in beside it and hope that proximity counted for something. He filed the approach authorization himself at 4:30 a.m. from the small desk in the corner of the rented room, using the secure IRA terminal that he'd had the technical team install on day 2 of the operation. He filled in every field with the careful precision of someone who understood that the paperwork in this instance was not bureaucratic formality but a genuine accounting of risk. His name, his designation, his personal acceptance of full liability for the decision and its consequences. He read it back once. He submitted it. He sat for a moment afterward in the quiet of the early morning and thought about what he was doing. Then he got up, put on his best formal robe, the dark gray one with the Branathi Legal Authority seal embossed on the left panel, which he had always found lent him a useful quality of gravitas in difficult situations, retrieved his legal data tablet from the case on the desk, and went to knock on the doors of Construct 7 and Construct 8. They were already awake. They were, he had come to understand over the course of the operation, always already awake. The Dorikai constructs did not sleep in the way organic beings slept. They had rest cycles, maintenance periods during which their processing ran at reduced capacity, but these were scheduled and brief and did not prevent them from responding to external input. When he knocked, both doors opened within the same second, and both constructs looked at him with the particular quality of attention that meant they had already assessed the situation and were waiting for him to say aloud what they had already inferred. "We're going in," Quivethsal said. "Yes," said Construct 7, "we assumed." 6:09 a.m., said Construct 8. "To arrive before Subject Alpha and establish position before the entity has a visual on new presences." Quivethsal looked at him. "You've already planned the approach." "We've been planning it since day 12, said Construct 7. "We did not mention it because you had not made the decision, but we saw no benefit in being unprepared when you did." Quivethsal considered this for a moment. There were, he reflected, significant advantages to working with beings whose response to uncertainty was not anxiety but contingency planning. "Right," he said. 6:09. They walked into Sector 9 as the acid fog was lifting. This was the particular quality of early morning in the district that Quivethsal had not appreciated from the surveillance feeds. The way the fog retreated with the first real light, pulling back from the streets in slow, dissipating layers that left everything it touched slightly damp and faintly copper-scented. The outer market was not yet open. The stalls were shuttered, the merchants still in their back rooms and upper floors, and the streets had the particular hollow quiet of a place that was populated but not yet alive. Their footsteps carried. The sound of them, Quivethsal's measured stride, the heavier and perfectly synchronized tread of the two constructs, echoed off the calmer stone facades in a way that made the silence around them feel denser by contrast. He was aware of being watched. Not by anyone he could see. There was no one visible in the streets at 6:09 a.m., no merchants at their shuttered stalls, no dockworkers on the upper walkways. But the district had eyes that didn't require bodies, the accumulated observational apparatus of beings who had learned to monitor their environment from safety, and Quivethsal had enough experience with places like this to know that the absence of visible watchers was not the absence of watching. They were noted. They were tracked. The information of their passage was flowing through the district's invisible network of mutual awareness. 3 strangers walking east, walking toward the ruins. walking toward her, and he did not look for the watchers because looking would have been bad manners and also would have confirmed that he knew they were there, which would have complicated everyone's comfortable pretense. The ruins came into view as they turned the corner at the old transit hub. Quivethsal had seen them on the surveillance feeds for 43 days. He had thought that familiarity with the image would prepare him for the reality. It did not. The feeds were good, high-resolution, properly calibrated, but they could not carry the quality that hit him now as he turned the corner and found the eastern quarter spread out before him in the early morning light, the sheer weight of the place. The silence that was not empty but full, dense with something older than the buildings that had broken and the civilization that had built them. The way the ruins sat in their own particular gravity, and at the center of that gravity, enormous and still and radiating a presence that was not warmth exactly, but was something that warmth was a small translation of. She was there. Of course she was there. She was always there. But knowing something from a screen and standing in the physical presence of it were two different categories of knowledge, and his body processed the second category the way bodies process things that matter, immediately, comprehensively, without asking permission first. Every system he had lit up at once, not with panic, but with the pure, ancient, involuntary recognition of being in proximity to something that existed on a scale his biology had not been built to process comfortably. His four eyes adjusted, widened, the way eyes widen not at darkness but at too much to see at once. Beside him, Construct 7 and Construct 8 had stilled in a way that was different from their normal stillness, more deliberate, as if they were actively holding themselves in place rather than simply having no reason to move. He noted this without comment. He understood it completely. And then, near the edge of her coiled tail, he saw Marcus Webb. Already there? Already setting up the makeshift table with the particular efficient familiarity of someone who had done this enough times that the movements had stopped requiring thought, who was running on the deep groove of routine in the way that humans, he had observed this in 31 years of working with and around them, ran on routine with a completeness that seemed to quiet something in them, some ongoing internal noise that the reliable repetition of ordinary things turned down to a manageable level. The canvas bag was open at his feet. The salvage metal tray was already in position. He was unwrapping the brisket with the careful, unhurried attention of a man for whom this mattered, not because it was grand, but because doing ordinary things with care was its own form of meaning. He looked up when he heard their footsteps. The expression on his face was, Quivethsal thought, exactly right. Mildly curious, mildly alert, the expression of a man who had encountered enough unusual things in his particular life that the appearance of a Branathi attorney flanked by two Dorikai constructs at 6:09 a.m. in the ruins of Sector 9 registered as notable but not alarming. There was an adaptability in it that Quivethsal recognized now, having watched it for 43 days. The adaptability of someone who had made a series of choices that took them progressively further from the ordinary, and who had found, at some point along the way, that the capacity for surprise was a thing you could set down if you chose to. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked. The words were so thoroughly, so perfectly normal, the words of a man asked if he can help you at a counter, in a depot, in a corridor, that Quivethsal felt something in his chest do a small, involuntary thing that he would later classify as gratitude. The normalcy of it was a gift. It was an invitation to simply proceed, to skip the part where they all acknowledged how unusual this was, and move directly to the part where something actually happened. "We are here on a legal matter," Quivethsal said. He kept his voice calm. He kept his eyes on Marcus, specifically on Marcus, because the alternative was to look at what was behind Marcus, and he was not prepared to do that yet, not while he was still trying to form sentences. He could feel the amber gaze the way you feel a significant source of heat, not on his skin but in some deeper register, a pressure that was not physical but that his body reported as physical because it had no other language for it. Like a second gravity pressing in from behind. "We need to serve notice to," he swallowed. He had not intended to swallow. The swallow was involuntary and unprofessional, and he was going to have to simply accept that it had happened and proceed. "To Soverus Kalendrath." Marcus stared at him, not with alarm, not with the particular sharpness of someone calculating threat, but with the considering look of someone fitting new information into an existing picture and checking where it landed. His eyes moved briefly to Kalendrath, that small, soft-eyed glance that the surveillance feed had caught so clearly, and that was somehow even more striking in person, the way it carried no performance at all, and then back. "You've been watching me," he said. It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had just retroactively processed 43 mornings and found, fitted into the background of each one, an observation he hadn't consciously registered, but that his subconscious had apparently been quietly nodding, and who was now presenting the conclusion not with anger or accusation, but with the mild, certain tone of someone confirming a thing they had already understood. 43 days, Quivethsal admitted. There was no point in managing the admission, no benefit in softening it or reframing it. He had watched this man for 43 days because no one else could do what he did, and Marcus Webb was clearly intelligent enough to have arrived at that conclusion already, and treating him as though he hadn't would have been both inaccurate and disrespectful. You are, to our knowledge, the only living being in this district who has successfully maintained regular contact with her without provoking a threat response. We needed to understand how. The words landed. Marcus received them. He was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet, not the quiet of someone formulating a response under pressure, but the quiet of someone who was genuinely thinking, who gave thought the room it needed rather than filling the space with words while the thinking happened beneath. He pulled a grain cake from his bag, set it on the tray with the specific, considered placement of someone arranging things the right way. His hands were steady. His attention was on the food for a moment, and then, in the way that attention moves when it finds its real subject, it shifted. She was alone, he said. Simply, without preamble, without the rhetorical architecture of someone making a point. Just the fact of it, offered plainly, the way you offer something that you have understood for a long time and that feels, to you, obvious, not because it is obvious, but because you have lived with it long enough that it has stopped feeling like an insight and has become just part of what you know. Everyone else was afraid of her, so she'd been alone for a long time. He paused. He was not looking at Quiveth Sol. He was looking at the grain cake on the tray, or perhaps past it, at something that wasn't in the immediate visual field but that he could see clearly anyway. I figured being alone that long had to hurt, even for something like her. Another pause, shorter than the first but heavier. Maybe especially for something like her. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Not the weight of unspoken tension or unresolved conflict, the weight of a true thing taking up the space a true thing requires, the density of a statement that cannot be answered with another statement because it has not asked a question. It had simply said a thing. And the thing it had said sat in the air between them and was, Quiveth Sol recognized with the part of himself that had been trained to know when something mattered, entirely correct. He had 17 centuries of legal documentation about Caelendrath the Undying. He had territorial disputes and breach of pact claims, and the ongoing lunar mineral rights question and 43 days of surveillance footage. He had the reports of 7 teams that hadn't made it past the ruin's edge, and the 9th report of Agent Thessavorn that said, I no longer know what we are watching, and 31 years of professional experience with beings who had power and the complicated relationships that power created between them and everyone else. He had not in any of it thought to ask how long she had been alone. He was still processing this, the shape of it, the dimensions of what it meant to be the oldest living thing in the known galaxy, and to have watched every civilization that might have been your equal dissolve into history before you when the sound came. It moved through the ground first. That was what struck him. It was not a sound you heard so much as a sound you were in, suddenly and completely, a low resonant rumble that entered through the soles of his feet and traveled upward through his skeleton and settled in his chest cavity like a bell that had been struck at a frequency too low for ears alone to manage. It was not a growl. He knew what growls felt like, had been present for several in his career, and they had a particular quality of compressed violence to them, energy being contained before release. This was the opposite of that. This was something releasing, a sound from deep in something vast, moving outward not as threat but as presence, as acknowledgement. Caelendrath had raised her head. Quiveth Sol's 4 eyes found her involuntarily, the way eyes find the sun not because you choose to look but because not looking requires an active effort that attention cannot always provide. She had lifted her great head from the ruins where it had been resting, and the movement of it slow, extraordinary, the motion of something whose scale made even slowness dramatic, had rearranged the geometry of the entire eastern quarter. The towers behind her looked smaller. The sky above her looked closer. The ruins, which had seemed large before, seemed now like the setting for something rather than the thing itself. She was looking directly at him. Quiveth Sol had been looked at by many beings in his career. He had been looked at by galactic arbitration justices, by hostile witnesses, by opposing counsel of legendary ferocity, by clients who needed him to be right and defendants who needed him to be wrong and observers who needed the spectacle of both. He understood being looked at. He was, by temperament and training, comfortable with scrutiny in almost all its forms. This was not scrutiny. This was something that scrutiny was a very, very small version of. This was 300 meters of ancient, comprehensive attention, focused, and focused was the right word, the way a lens focuses light, concentrating it directly at him, not examining him, not assessing him. Simply being aware of him, fully and completely and without any of the filtering that most beings applied to awareness, the automatic dimming that allowed normal life to proceed without being overwhelmed by the full weight of every perception. She was not filtering. She was simply attending, and her attendance had the quality of a natural force. The 2 Dorikai constructs who had faced down warships, who had stood in plasma discharge, who were engineered to be, in almost every measurable sense, the most capable security entities in the IRA's considerable arsenal. They did not move. They appeared to have temporarily forgotten how, frozen not by fear, but by something more complete than fear. The simple mechanical reality of systems encountering an input that exceeded the parameters they had been built to process, standing very still while everything recalibrated. Quivethsal understood this. He was himself standing very still. He was standing very still and thinking with remarkable clarity about every decision that had led to this moment, and finding that he did not regret any of them, which was either a sign of good judgment or a sign that he had not yet fully understood the situation. Then Marcus Webb turned around. He turned the way you turn when you hear something you recognize, not the startled turn of the unprepared, but the easy, unhurried turn of someone responding to a familiar sound in a familiar place. He was holding a grain cake. He had apparently taken it from the tray in the same motion as turning, with the automatic competence of someone whose hands know what's needed before the thought arrives. He looked at Calendrath. The amber eye moved from Quivethsal to him, and the shift in it was visible, tangible. The difference between the attention of an ocean and the attention of an ocean that has found the thing it was waiting for, that specific quality of settling, of arriving, of attention that Quivethsal hadn't even been able to identify as tension until it released. "Morning, Collie," Marcus Webb said. "You've got company today, be nice." The words were so perfectly, so completely ordinary that Quivethsal felt something in his chest that he would spend considerable time afterward trying to name and would eventually settle on relief. Not because the danger was past, he was not yet certain the danger was past, but because someone in this situation clearly knew exactly what they were doing and it was not him. And that was fine, that was entirely fine, that was in fact the best possible news. She lowered her great head to the ground. 6 feet from the makeshift table, which put her approximately 8 feet from where Quivethsal was standing, and the slow, deliberate descent of that enormous head, the way it came down with a kind of restrained care, the way something very large is careful with itself when it has decided to be, was the most precise communication Quivethsal had ever observed without words. It said, "I have heard. I have considered. Proceed." She waited. Marcus looked back at Quivethsal. The expression on his face said, with complete clarity and zero ambiguity, "Well, go ahead then." There was something in it that was also perhaps very faintly amused, the expression of someone who has been doing an extraordinary thing for 11 months and has just watched the people who were observing him discover that doing it is more complicated in practice than in theory. Quivethsal stepped forward. He stepped forward on legs that were entirely steadier than they had any right to be, which he attributed partly to 31 years of professional conditioning, and partly to the simple fact that the decision had already been made, the authorization already filed, the liability already accepted, and the only thing left was to do the thing. He held out the data tablet with both hands, the formal position, the two-handed offer that the Galactic Arbitration Court required for official notice, which he performed now with the same precision he would have performed it in a courtroom because precision was what he had, and it was what he was going to use. "Soverus Calendrath," he said. His voice trembled on the second syllable of her name, just once, brief, entirely involuntary, and then his professional self took back the controls and held. "You are formally notified of proceedings before the Galactic Arbitration Court, case number." He stopped, because Calendrath had moved her gaze. Slowly, with the absolute regal deliberateness of a being who has never in 17 centuries been required to hurry for anyone and sees no reason to begin now, from the data tablet in Quivethsal's outstretched hands to the makeshift tray on the salvage metal surface, to the grain cakes arranged in their careful row, back to Quivethsal. The amber eye waited. Marcus Webb made a sound that was unambiguously a snort. It was the sound of a man who has seen this before, who has understood exactly what is happening, and who finds it, despite everything, despite the context, despite the 300-meter elder dragon and the IRA attorney and the 2 frozen Dorikai constructs, genuinely funny. He did not try to make the sound more dignified. He let it be exactly what it was. "She'll listen," he said to Quivethsal, already reaching into his canvas bag with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has learned the terms of a negotiation through long practice and respects them. He pulled out a second tray's worth brisket cakes, the supplementary items arranged with the same careful precision as always, and set it down directly in front of her nose, close enough that the scent of it would reach her in full. "She's just negotiating." The word landed with precision. Negotiating, not demanding, not threatening. Negotiating, the entirely reasonable behavior of a party with leverage who understands exactly what they have and is content to wait for the other party to acknowledge it. Quivethsal looked at the dragon. He was a lawyer. He had spent 31 years in rooms with parties who had leverage and the patience to use it, and he knew in his bones, in his professional soul, that when a party with leverage was willing to wait, the correct response was not to let the moment go on longer than it needed to. It was to meet the terms with good grace and proceed. He looked at the tray, he looked at the dragon, he opened his briefcase. The emergency diplomatic ration bar was standard IRA field equipment, included in briefing kits for situations involving extended negotiations or delayed proceedings where an attorney might need to sustain themselves through a longer than anticipated session. It was compressed, dense, slightly sweet, wrapped in regulation IRA packaging. He had never used one. He had thought of them as the sort of item you carry because the kit list says you carry it and never actually need. He placed it on the tray. Kalendrath's eye regarded it, closed halfway, that slow, measured closing that her eye did when she was processing something, when she was deciding. Opened again. Her tail moved, almost lazily, the particular quality of movement that belongs to something so large that its casual motion is still significant, curling with slow deliberateness half a meter closer. Not toward Quivethsal, toward the tray. Toward the space between the tray and the human standing next to it, and by proximity toward the whole small arrangement of this improbable morning. Acceptance? Not warm, not effusive. She was 17 centuries old and had eaten ambassadors and swallowed a moon, and warmth was not her register. But acceptance, clearly and completely communicated, in the language of a being who communicated through presence and proximity and the willingness to remain. Quivethsal cleared his throat, adjusted his grip on the tablet, found to his genuine surprise that his hands were steady. He began to read. He would later tell colleagues that it was the most unusual deposition he had ever conducted. He would tell them that the elder dragon listened to every word without interruption, sitting through the full recitation of case numbers and jurisdictional claims, and the legal summaries of 4 territorial disputes and 3 breach of pact suits, and 1 extraordinarily complicated lunar mineral rights, proceeding with the patient, complete attention of a party who understood that proceedings had their forms and was willing to honor the forms. Even if she had forgotten more about the civilizations that had written them than the beings currently enforcing them would ever know. He would tell them that she had indicated her acknowledgement of 3 separate legal clauses by breathing precisely timed jets of warm air across the tablet screen, which his legal team would spend 6 weeks debating, filing briefs, counterbriefs, and 1 especially impassioned supplementary brief that ran to 40 pages, and ultimately concluded that the acknowledgements almost certainly counted as binding consent under the voluntary awareness doctrine. Assuming they could establish that an elder dragon's breath was an intentional communicative act, which, given 17 centuries of documented behavior suggesting that Kalendrath the Undying did nothing accidentally, they believed they could. He would tell colleagues all of this. He would become, briefly, one of the more sought-after speakers at interstellar legal conferences, because the attorney who successfully served notice on an elder dragon was a story that the legal community found both professionally fascinating and personally reassuring, evidence that the forms of law were respected even at the outermost edges of what law was built to handle. He would tell them the professional version, the version that had case numbers and precedent implications, and the 6-week brief about voluntary communicative acts. What he did not tell colleagues, what he kept only for himself, quiet and certain, filed in the part of the self where the things that actually matter are kept because they don't belong in briefing rooms or conference presentations, was the moment near the end. He had been on the final clause. Marcus Webb had drifted, in the way he drifted through these mornings, from the specific task of the day back into the easy, familiar current of ordinary conversation, talking about the water pipe which had not been fixed because Oren had thought about it and arrived at no conclusions, and which Marcus had now decided required a different approach involving direct engagement with the actual building infrastructure rather than the building manager. He was explaining this approach with the focused, satisfied energy of someone who has found the right solution to a long-standing problem and is telling someone else about it before doing it, the way people do when the solution has made them happy and they want the happiness to have an audience. He had drifted, as he talked, to a position beside Kalendrath's folded foreleg. Not deliberately, not as a statement, simply in the way that people drift toward warmth when they are comfortable, without marking the moment, without deciding to, just moving slightly in the direction of the thing that made the morning feel like it was supposed to feel. His shoulder had come to rest very lightly against the edge of her foreleg, which rose beside him like a dark wall of ancient scale, warm in the way that stone is warm when it has absorbed heat deeply, steadily, without the variable flicker of something living in a hurry. He went on talking, the water pipe, the approach, Oren's theoretical future understanding of load-bearing pipe infrastructure, which Marcus apparently planned to cultivate through the medium of diagrams. And Kalendrath, Elder Dragon, Omega Apex, Soverus Kalendrath the Undying who had watched 17 civilizations and eaten ambassadors and swallowed a moon, tilted her vast head. Barely, a fraction of a degree, perhaps less, the movement so small that it would not have registered on the surveillance feeds, would not have made it into any official documentation, would not have been visible to anyone who was not standing exactly where Quivethsal was standing and looking exactly where he was looking with all four eyes at once, and the attention of someone who had spent 31 years learning to see what matters in the small things. She tilted her head in the direction of the small, warm, unbothered human weight against her foreleg. Toward it and not away from it. With intention, with deliberateness, with the quality of something choosing, not for the first time, not as a new discovery, but as the continued expression of a long, quiet, entirely private decision made and remade every morning for 11 months. As if it was the only anchor she had found in 17 centuries, worth holding still for. Quivethsal finished reading the final clause. He lowered the tablet. The deposition was complete, the forms honored, the legal record established. He would walk back through the ruins in a few minutes, back through the outer market as it began to open, back to the rented room and the secure terminal and the long work of actually prosecuting the cases he had just served notice for. He stood for a moment and let the morning be what it was, the soft early light on the broken commerce stone, the last of the acid fog retreating from the streets, the sound of Marcus Webb explaining load-bearing pipe infrastructure to the oldest living thing in the known galaxy. The amber eye half open, patient as geology. Watching him go when he finally went. Watching all of them go, the attorney and his constructs walking back west through the ruins, growing smaller until the broken towers swallowed the sight of them. And after they were gone, the city beginning its noise, the merchants opening their stalls, the district filling slowly with the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. Kalendrath settled her great head back into the ruins and listened to one unremarkable human finish his morning and pack up his bag with the same care he had unpacked it, moving through his routine with the quiet, steady ease of someone who was exactly where he intended to be. She was still listening when he said goodbye, the same way he always said it, simply, without ceremony, without waiting for a response that would not come in any language he could hear. She was still listening when his footsteps faded west toward the depot. She was still there when the morning finished and the afternoon began and the district went on around her, moving the way the world moves around things that have been still long enough to become part of the landscape, without acknowledgement, without ceremony. But something in the vast, ancient, unhurried interior of her had already moved forward to tomorrow morning. 6:14 a.m. The soft one with the canvas bag and the smoked brisket and the ongoing water pipe situation, walking east through the fog while everyone else looked away. She would be here. She was always here. But now, for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed, here was somewhere she was choosing to be.